Eric thinks Apple should start making Wi-Fi and networking gear again. Stick around and find out what that means for your home network. Eric Welander is an app developer and content creator that loves Apple and smart home tech. He's been making videos about it all on YouTube since 2018 and is closing in on 50,000 subscribers. Welcome, Eric. And could you explain what you mean by wanting Apple to produce some new products for Wi-Fi or networking?
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Thanks for having me on here. I think that it goes back to something that's a core value, it seems like, of Tim Cook and what has been coined by some folks as the Cook Doctrine. As Tim Cook says, we believe that we need to own and control the primary technologies behind the products we make and participate only in markets where we can make a significant contribution. And of course, right now, it seems like Apple doesn't feel like they can make a significant contribution in Wi-Fi routers and home networking because they're not really in that space. But at the same time, I think that it's so key to so many of their products and the use of their products at home. Whether you're talking about the flaky Wi-Fi connection of a HomePod Mini that's maybe a little bit far away from your access point, all the way to just wanting to back up some family member's MacBook Air with a network time machine. There's just different layers that seem like Apple could provide an elegant solution in a way like they used to. And I think there's also then some expanded business plays there. For example, one great Wi-Fi vendor for years has been Eero. And one of the things they do, and some other Wi-Fi vendors do similar things, is selling some kind of a network security service. And that could be a combination of content filtering or monitoring combined with a VPN. And I could see Apple making sort of a privacy-first interpretation of that, of course, supplying a VPN, which appeals to a lot of folks, as well as maybe some kind of content filtering. Apple's probably wouldn't be very granular, but, blocking malicious websites and things that Apple decide to put on a deny list. I could see people seeing some value in that and paying for it. And then in turn, this kind of a product becoming another piece of, back to what Tim Cook loves, is hardware, software, and services. And I think putting all that together, you'd start to think about some really nice packages of products that, yes, they're not going to appeal to every single person who buys an iPhone, but for a lot of these Apple families who use a lot of Apple tech in their home, it could add up to something really nice.
That's a really good point. I think the key here is that Tim Cook has given himself a lot of leeway in that position on determining whether it is or isn't in their best interest. But a quick thought here. A lot of what you describe, Apple is already doing with software and features for privacy and security that doesn't require new hardware. The random private IP address option for all iOS devices, the VPN-like features they've added to Safari for better protection from advertising, tracking, and things like that. So I would think that Apple has to make a hard choice of whether they actually want to get their feet back into hardware or just reap all the software benefits. I think they could offer more services that do network protection, network security, but I'm not sure they have to do hardware.
Well, I think that's what they tried to do with HomeKit router. If you remember that, around, I think it was even the same WWDC, they came out with HomeKit Secure Video.
HomeKit supports a wide variety of other accessories, but many accessories don't just connect via HomeKit. They also connect via the internet and through your router. And unfortunately, this can leave them open to attack. And we want to make sure that this can't happen. And so we're bringing HomeKit to routers. Now with HomeKit at the router, we'll automatically firewall off each of your accessories. So even if one were to be compromised, it wouldn't be able to access your other devices or compromise your personal information.
It's fallen flat, and there was news coming out of this year's CES that a lot of router vendors just aren't getting that support from Apple anymore. And so there aren't really any new HomeKit routers coming to the market. It seems like that's kind of dying. And that was one of those sort of privacy-minded software-only plays by Apple, thinking just like with the smart home tech, they could make some kind of a software standard, get a bunch of vendors to comply with that standard, and then have a product where they don't have to do a lot of the work. I mean, you see Apple do this in similar sort of fringe categories with their friends at Belkin and Logitech, where they'll get those companies to make some kind of an accessory for one of their other Apple products. But I think that when it comes to the software, it seems like that whole play hasn't really worked out for them. So I think that's where maybe going back to the hardware could be a good play, especially because there's so much I think Apple could do to innovate here in ways that are specific to their product experiences. I think that there's potentially some ways they could have more dedicated radios for things like, let's say, HomeKit Secure Video, or connections for their HomePods and HomePod Minis, to make sure that those stay online and stay responsive. And I mean, I hear from a lot of viewers of my channel and experience this myself, plenty of times where some of these devices go offline. Some of my best HomeKit hubs is something that's connected hardwired with Ethernet, like my Apple TV. And so I think doing something that is more possible, of course, with Wi-Fi than to expect people to just hardwire everything in their homes is a big thing to ask of people. So I think where they could supply dedicated radios for that, as well as maybe a mesh system that has, like some other competitors do, sort of dedicated backhaul radios for the mesh to communicate, you could start to see a product where Apple could sort of say to these customers coming into the Apple store frustrated about why their smart home isn't working, well, if you just throw this money at the problem, it'll go away. And right now there isn't really an option like that.
Actually, I agree with you quite a bit. I think if Apple supplied Wi-Fi hardware, networking gear a little bit for a consumer, it would solve a lot of problems. But I look at it from a different way. The biggest problem it would solve is tech support. We have a saying in the custom industry, at the end of the day, the reason you're paying for installer or paying for more advanced products is to have one throat to choke. You want one person or one company to call, and no matter what, they have to fix it. You don't want to hear excuses, finger pointing, it's their implementation isn't following our recommendations, or they didn't add this feature, or their build quality is poor, and that's why the price is low. But I think with Apple, it's what we saw many years ago with printers. When Apple made laser printers, we didn't have problems using printers. Now we do. Ask any consumer or office worker, what's their number one tech problem? And it's still printers. The only reason you hear less is because we print a lot less. But when you have to print, it hurts. So I would agree with you there.
One other point on that too, you were mentioning the software earlier and what could Apple do in terms of software. One of the other things I've wondered if it's happened behind the scenes, but I don't really see signs of it. I thought for a while maybe it would be happening with Linksys, but in the enterprise space, of course, Apple selling into big companies, Apple has quite an extensive internal organization around making sure their technology works in those kinds of use cases. And one of the things they've done in that department, from what I've seen from the outside, is a close partnership with companies like Cisco, and then Cisco is able to supply a lot of Apple-specific networking features and give enterprises an advantage of, well, if you buy Apple products for your employees and then you buy our networking gear, here are the benefits you get. And I could see this going the route of maybe not an official partner, but sort of a partner that plays by Apple's rules and gives Apple users everything they want. And unfortunately, I haven't seen this materialize. I was in this regard really sad when Eero got acquired by Amazon. I think Amazon's done a phenomenal job with them, but it's certainly ruled them out as far as being that preferred networking partner with Apple to not only be sold in the Apple stores, but also just to have that extra level of Apple integration and polish and software design. You see a little bit of that maybe with Ubiquiti, but I think Ubiquiti with their Alien routers that are now sold in the Apple stores, it's kind of a small company to scale to that global size that Apple would need in that case.
Well, there's a delicate balancing act that has to go on here. All of networking is based on standards, yet how each company implements the standard varies, and that friction is where we have problems with the HomeKit networking. Apple doesn't want to go out and say everyone has to be Apple HomeKit certified for their networking equipment, but they almost do. In reality, I see the same smart plug that falls off HomeKit network once a day or once a week, right at that moment is still accessible from Amazon Alexa, Google, or Home Assistant on the same Wi-Fi equipment with nothing else changed. So being polite here, I would say the way Apple uses some unique or lesser used networking protocols isn't fully tested and debugged by the other network gear companies. So Apple could either build all their own network and Wi-Fi gear or just institute a certification and more rigorous testing, but in a cooperative way with the hardware manufacturers. Editor Robert stepping in here. No discussion of network problems and compatibility issues can really be complete without talking about one of the first successful network operating systems, Novell NetWare. Novell created a large third-party testing, compatibility, and certification program called Yes, It Runs with NetWare. So there is precedent for one company having a certification and testing program to ensure other companies to make hardware that was tested, certified, and supported.
You could say, back to the integrating with standards, that it really matters how well smart plugs support, whether it's Matter or HomeKit. I think it also gets to the other difference I see with a lot of routers out there is that there are companies that are good at software and there are companies that are not good at software. And so if you are buying into a router system and you get one that has a good mobile app, that has a good web interface, that can make all the difference in the world for managing it in your home. And that's another place where I think Apple, again, hasn't always been the best with software quality when it comes to Apple Home. So maybe they wouldn't be able to put the attention and love that would take to do a really excellent job at it. I mean, I certainly think they're capable. It's just a question of would it actually happen if they decided to go down this road.
Thank you so much for watching this video. You are awesome. If you enjoy this video and want to see more, toggle the subscribe button, automate the bell icon, and then get started on your next smart home project.
So, we'll see where they actually turn with this. I think that it's a challenge, though, for some of us Apple Home users who are looking for ways to make our homes more reliable that are pretty straightforward and would work in almost every case. If I just did this, things would work better. Thread is potentially moving in that direction, and Apple's devices, of course, are already routers for Thread, although they're not for Wi-Fi. And so maybe Thread sort of alleviates a lot of this for everything but cameras. But then again, I mean, cameras and connecting them via Wi-Fi are still probably a pretty big part of a lot of people's smart homes.
Definitely. Well, there's another area where I think Apple could really do something exciting here. When Eero was bought by Amazon, some of us were hoping that they might combine the voice assistant with the access points, the mesh points, the smart speaker, and do something interesting there. When you look at our smart homes, in a lot of rooms or multiple rooms, we want to have a speaker, a voice assistant, and we need a Wi-Fi access point mesh to extend the range. And now, of course, with Thread, we'll need the Thread border routers. So I think it's coming back full circle to where an integrated device, which is where Apple could really optimize it for HomeKit, for Apple devices, would be significant. I mean, we hear rumors of Apple taking the HomePod and mashing a screen onto it somehow to catch up to what Amazon did 5 years ago. But I think more needs to be done there.
Yeah, I think that really fits with some of what I get the impression of is something Apple sees customers really liking, which is integrating more use cases into one product. You see this with Apple TV, where I think they thought, well, people aren't necessarily going to want to buy a hub for their smart home, but they are going to want to buy a set-top box, and we can make that a hub for your smart home. And maybe they aren't going to want to buy a dedicated smart speaker that costs $300, but you could see them spending $600 on TV speakers, and then you can put together this system that's a smart home hub and Apple TV as well for set-top box and viewing TV these speakers, and then the smart speaker that can play music and respond to your requests, all kinds of things. And I can see that as the smart home market hopefully grows to a bigger audience, a lot more people wanting to get one thing that takes care of it all. Google's already done this with some of their Nest hubs that take care of a lot of this wireless transmission all in one box. And I could see Apple making a compelling play here where Apple's going to want to keep their prices high for some of these devices, but if the device does a lot of different things for the customer, then you could see people being more willing to spend the $300 or $400 for something that's not only good quality, but it's going to get rid of a lot of extra other devices in your home. Now, for a lot of us geeks who love to fiddle with all these details, we're going to want to get the most optimal and latest and greatest of any one of these individual components probably. And it's, I think the risk there for Apple is that they launch something like that and a lot of the sort of tech observer social media and press groups sort of poo-poo it because they're always looking for the latest and greatest tech. And I don't think this kind of device would be really designed for that purpose. But yeah, I could see some kind of a home device that, again, relays a lot of these things. But at the same time, let's say, for example, in, whatever month's time, Apple does come out with a HomePod with an iPad strapped to it, so to speak, or an iPad that also kind of functions as a smart speaker, then that thing isn't going to probably relay your existing Wi-Fi signal. Apple's going to need some kind of a story there for, a story in like the corporate sense, some kind of like a product to fill that need of the main internet hub for your home. And I don't know if they're actually going to do that. And so then this device is going to come out. It's not going to be a Wi-Fi access point amongst other things. And then I think we're going to have to wait to see if they'll ever do that with a future generation of this iPad smart home screen product, which probably is not going to get updates every single year.
And honestly, that's one of my big concerns. If Apple gets into home networking hardware, they'll come out with a great product, but they have a history of one and done. They wait a long time between updates or revisions. There's even rumors internally they move teams off a project and don't reassign them to work on it again until they decide to update it. Networking and Wi-Fi, there's constantly changes, improvements, evolution. Even if it's not that critical, not everyone needs Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 7 right away, but there are a lot of people that want it. And one of the things about Apple products is getting the latest and greatest and staying up to date. So do you think Apple could make the commitment to keep networking gear updated more frequently than some of the other products?
I mean, I don't think they're going to update it more frequently, but I think the bigger challenge there is how do you grow and maintain a talented team inside Apple to keep shipping new versions of this technology at whatever pace makes sense from a spreadsheet and business and financial perspective. Because if you get these talented engineers in there and they're not feeling challenged enough to push the envelope with some of these new technologies and find new use cases and wow, look at this, we can make something that's a point-to-point connection between these two access points that's basically as reliable as Ethernet, but it's wireless. And maybe it's some proprietary Apple take or fork of a shared technology, or all kinds of layers there where, yes, I don't think Apple would need to keep up with the latest iterations of the Wi-Fi spec and come out with, they certainly didn't when they had the airport line. But I do think the challenge there is keeping a team inside Apple motivated and working on this long term. Not only just, and I think in part because I get the impression that there's some sort of dedicated knowledge in that industry of doing home networking and also just in smart home tech in general that's maybe a little bit different than some of their other products. Now, Wi-Fi, of course, there's Wi-Fi radios in a lot of Apple products, and we've heard stories about how Apple attempted to build their own version of the Qualcomm modems they use in the iPhone, and that seems to have not panned out the way at least I think Apple had hoped. So that technology, obviously, like owning a key piece of the iPhone's radios is a very high stakes thing, and they have to pay Qualcomm a lot of money. So there's a very logical business case of probably why they would want to do that kind of a move, but that doesn't seem to be working out for them. And I wonder, when the stakes are lower and the addressable market is much smaller than every iPhone user. I wonder if it's actually going to be something that Apple would be able to logistically pull off. Now, that said, I mean, Mark Gurman over at Bloomberg has covered a lot of executives mostly going from Apple, longtime executives and people who oversee things that intersect with a lot of products we've mentioned here, like the HomePod and the Apple TV. So I don't read too much into those rumors, but I do think it's something worth considering is that maybe some of the old guard who has turned down some of these ideas in the past is on their way out, not for any bad or malicious reason, I think, but people move on, things change in their lives, they decide to retire, whatever. And I think that we might hopefully see some new folks come in who hopefully put a different priority on some of these things with smart home tech, networking especially.
Let me ask you about tech support from Apple. Even beyond or before building their own hardware, I think there's room for them to increase the level of tech support for networking, specifically with the HomeKit. Have you ever had to contact Apple for a HomeKit networking issue? I've got a little anecdote to relate, but I'm curious about your experience.
I have not done that myself, but I have talked to friends or viewers who have talked to Apple Care or Apple Support about various issues, but I haven't heard any like very specific details on that.
I recently installed a new HomePod Mini, and I got a strange error card popping up saying something with my network was preventing it from working and I needed to fix my network. So for the fun of it, I contacted Apple, and what I found, Apple is incredibly polite, very courteous, extremely proactive, getting your information, contacting you again if they say they're going to follow up. But their troubleshooting was entirely reading from a script. They just repeated back the same things I could Google and find in Apple Tech Notes. And getting to the actual issue, I had two questions for them. What does this message really mean in more technical terms so I can reconfigure my router or my switch? This is too general purpose, but doesn't really say anything. And second, what are the recommended network settings from Apple at a more technical level that I should ensure my equipment is using? And I could never get an answer to either of those. Now, this extremely polite, and I have to say my experience with other companies is much worse, but he said, I'll escalate to engineering. Now, if you've ever dealt with Apple tech support, that's the black hole. I mean, he said, I will absolutely get back to you in 2 or 3 days. I'll keep you informed. And he did. But there is a firewall in the figurative sense, not networking, between support at Apple and engineering. They have a very limited hole to send an email or an internal ticket, and they have to wait to get a response. And they get the same boilerplate, here's what it means, which is nothing, and they regurgitate it to me. And as they're reading it back to me, they're apologizing profusely. Say, I know this isn't really what you asked, and this is really frustrating for you. All the proper customer support tactic to diffuse the situation, but they couldn't solve it.
I mean, I think there are two sides of this. One is the error report message itself. Error reporting in software is very hard, especially I'd imagine with something like smart home tech where there are so many variables that could be going wrong. And so for the software itself to provide an error that accurately diagnoses the issue, I think is a lot to ask. I'm glad to hear, and I'm not surprised that Apple's tech support is very polite and as helpful as they can be, but of course, just sticking to what you can probably dig up in their tech notes and knowledge base documents. That said, though, I think Apple's usual approach to anything like this is more to just ship products that remove the need for this help to begin with and are sort of reliable and graceful enough in sort of adapting where, yes, if maybe you hit an unlucky path a certain way, but then if you reset things, it'll just go on as usual, and then limiting the features overall of the device so that you actually get something that will work in the cases where it's actually supported. And I think some of that also goes into maybe not always jumping on the latest bandwagons of technology like Wi-Fi 7. We don't see Wi-Fi 7 in any Apple devices at this point. And I think we've been pretty negative on Apple and smart home tech so far in this conversation, but I think the reason we're here talking about it in the first place is because I really like in large part the decisions they've made with their platform in terms of what they support to keep things simple and straightforward. Yes, there are other automation platforms that offer you more features and more troubleshooting tools and ways you can dig into advanced automation, but the reality is between Apple Home and Shortcuts, you can do so much to automate your Apple life at home, and it's in a lot of ways very plug and play and for the most part, very reliable. So I think it's easy to complain and wishcast about what we would like to see Apple do, whether it's networking and, things where we think that, it would take their reliability to another level. My view from this is like, if you have to go to Apple tech support, at a certain point, the product probably failed in some way to get to that point. Now, it's not to say you could avoid all tech support across the board. Some of that is also just educating the user on what's going on. And some of that is filled by YouTube, of course, and then Apple's documentation and support lines. Apple used to have that program in their stores called one-to-one, where you could sort of get a lesson from someone in the Apple store about something. That's obviously gone away, but I think it has trouble scaling. But you could see some other things along those lines. I think there are plenty of folks and creators out there happy to make content, paid or free, that sort of helps hold users' hands along some of these journeys. But it is tough because, for example, I see people sometimes coming into like my videos in the comments, and they'll have some obscure problem with Apple Home that they're trying to get help on. And it's just like, it doesn't scale, and it's very tough to properly diagnose and give helpful feedback to someone in the comment of a YouTube video or, another social media post in the comments, right? You're not going to have more than like 2 or 3 back and forths at the most, and you're probably not going to get to a solution. And so that's always something too, where it's like, I feel bad that people are having tech problems, but support is a very difficult thing to scale and do well. And it's also in some ways a thankless job that a lot of people don't care to be involved in. It's an interesting experience you have had there with Apple support.
Well, you bring up a great point, and I also want to emphasize, we only criticize and give feedback and input to companies and products we care about. So sometimes it sounds like we're only complaining when we're focusing on the 5 or the 10% of the friction, but people need to remember that we've already written off complete the Googles, the Amazons, even the Samsungs, that have done absolutely nothing in smart home that's respectable or usable when compared to what Apple has done. That's not to say there are big challenges and more opportunities ahead, but also on tech support for HomeKit or networking in general, there's a key thing here, which is like the personal computer, the iPad, the iPhone, the smart home has brought us back to a multi-user heterogeneous environment. So Apple and all the vendors have to realize their products are not used in isolation, and that requires a change in mindset for tech support and troubleshooting. Maybe it's okay to expose some technical messages that may not be understandable by everyone, but their network administrator or their network helper or their 15-year-old teenager could go, aha, I know what to change in a router based on seeing, as in my former case, the error was related to universal plug and play not being enabled on the network. But that terminology was never used or directly exposed in the error reporting.
Yeah. And, I think that kind of taking this conversation in a little bit different direction, I think as we talked about earlier with Wi-Fi and what does Apple decide to do and what do they decide not to do? Do they decide to do anything with software like HomeKit Router? Do they decide to make their own hardware like they did in the past with Airport? Or do they decide to do neither? And with Apple Home, in terms of, obviously, if they're pursuing more into the home, there is sort of a tech support burden. There's a multi-user problem to solve in terms of how do you share this across users. Of course, with the Apple Home app right now, you can invite your family into that. And Apple has things like iCloud family sharing, which is another sort of multi-user service. But a lot of their devices, as you mentioned, are really intended to be single-user devices. And I've been thinking about a lot with Matter sort of coming more into the center of the smart home. Maybe in the future, if Matter starts to add support for sharing things like device names as well as room names, because I think a room as a concept is pretty consistent across the board. How much does Apple's smart home strategy and Apple Home as an app become more like Apple Mail versus Apple Notes? And what I mean by that is, yes, there are some edge cases with Apple Notes, but for the large part, if you're using Apple Notes, you're using it in iCloud, and it's sort of Apple's walled garden where you put everything there and it syncs and it's great. And Apple's put a lot of effort into the Notes experience, and it's really good across all of their devices. But at the same time, with Apple Mail, yes, you can have an iCloud mail address and you can go all in with sort of using iCloud for your email, but you can sign into any number of different email providers. And really at that point, Apple Mail is just a client to your broader email experience that's somewhere else on the web and, through some other provider. And I wonder with Apple Home, how much are we going towards something that's still more what we've had in the past, which is, I think, closer to Apple Notes, where you buy things that work with HomeKit. You're all about HomeKit. You do everything in then HomeKit, and then now it's called Apple Home, and keeping all that compatibility there, all your automations run in that app, versus something where you set up a new device or a new sort of iCloud account your first time you get an Apple device, then you sort of sign into a number of different home services, and then all that comes in, and the Home app is just your way to interact with your smart home on your Apple devices. Meanwhile, the real intelligence and the real troubleshooting and logs and details and multi-user support is all done with some other hub somewhere else on your home network and probably managed by some other company or group.
I think Apple needs to decide how much of the smart home they really want to play in, because to date, they haven't built any actual smart home devices other than HomePods and a few other minor accessories. There are analysts and industry people that have said they need to build smart plugs and build all the devices themselves and take responsibility and have a complete system. Now, there's pros and cons to that, and that would fill hours of discussion. But I think Apple, by not making that decision yet, has embraced compatibility and interoperability, at least at one level, as being a requirement for them delivering their solution. Now, I don't think they want other automation platforms controlling Apple devices. I don't think they want to see Home Assistant become the large independent automation controller other than for hobbyists and advanced consumers. But by default, the lack of features in some areas that some, I'd say not just hobbyists, but mid-level consumers want are driving people to look for other options. So longer term, I hope they continue to develop Home app and the automation capability and shortcuts and in the HomePods or even in Apple TV devices so that we don't need to look outside for just bread and butter, normal capabilities. I think there'll always be that unique special device that does a really interesting thing, but we shouldn't have to go there just, for example, for an auto off timer that doesn't require a shortcut and spinning on one leg and rotating around 3 times to make it work.
Yes, but at the same time, all this integration we have with Apple Home, there's so many places where the HomePods or just the voice assistant from Apple in general falls down where you ask it, hey, turn on this scene at 3 p.m.
Open the pod bay doors, please, Hal. Open the pod bay doors, please, Hal. Hello, Hal, do you read me? Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
And it doesn't know how to do that or fails, even if maybe it should actually succeed. And so I think it's tricky to say how much an integrated approach is actually going to benefit a company like Apple. But, I think that it's at a certain point, I think the problems might scale to a point where it's stuff that Apple doesn't want to deal with. And I think there's room for a company who can disrupt the space by giving it attention and a level of scale relative to the company that matters more to that particular group or company. There's a number of automation platforms out there for the home. I mean, Robert, you have a lot of experience with some of the more dinosaur-like professional installer versions of these. And then there, in the consumer space, as you mentioned, there's Home Assistant and Homey Pro, and Habitat's another one out there. So there are other options, but you're right. Then you try and do something simple, and the experience just isn't there for taking care of simple tasks where you could just quickly do it in your Apple Home. And then you start to have things in multiple worlds, which gets confusing. While you have limitations in Apple Home, at least you know where to go when you're looking for stuff. If you start to fracture into multiple platforms like this, then it gets harder, which I know I've heard you, Robert, on, I think it was the Automators podcast recently, talking about how you use Amazon for voice assistant and then Apple for a lot of your sort of automation and control. Now, I can understand, given, you and I sort of work in the smart home space to some degree, so there can be a desire to keep up with more than just one particular platform. But I'm wondering if it's a setup you'd recommend for someone else to do, or if that was just something you do more to be able to test different systems.
That's a good question. I use Alexa primarily because that's what we started with before Siri did much with the smart home. And in my own home, the users, the rest of the people in the house, don't want to switch. And it is more reliable for smart home operations. But I don't recommend that. My single biggest advice for anyone setting up a smart home is to pick one ecosystem and try to stay within it as much as possible, even if it doesn't mean getting the least expensive or most affordable product for each function that you need. So it's hard to do that from a budget and personal control to not jump out and buy the best thing on sale or the fancy HomePod or whatever you like. But I like to bring this around to a kind of closing concept. I think you're onto something with wanting Apple to do more with home networking and HomeKit and providing a complete solution. But I want to point you towards one of the things that's happening in the mainstream networking market. There's a lot of emphasis on software-defined networking, or SDNs, which are overlays and layers on top of the basic wide area networking protocols that have been used for many years. And on the security side, there's an evolution to a new processor technology called Zero Trust Networking. And I was personally very disappointed when HomeKit Secure Router didn't take off, because that really was a step in the first direction of Zero Trust Network. But on the positive side, a lot of these networking innovations are software and firmware embedded in every piece of networking equipment, all the way from the PC or Mac computer to iPhones or smartphones, to Ethernet switches, routers, gateways, bridges, which is more important than the physical hardware. So I would like to see Apple consider a holistic networking solution specifically for privacy, embracing zero trust networking, perhaps implementing that primarily in firmware and software, and even having their pieces embedded in the routers and gateways from your internet provider or the carrier, implementing an Apple secure channel end to end.
Yeah, I think it's certainly, whether it's a software solution or a hardware solution, I think that there's more Apple could be doing here to make this whole networking technology stack more reliable. One of the things that I've been impressed with Apple is with the new home architecture, which they sort of released and had some issues with and then re-released. But, it got some bad press initially, but it was a really good step forward, especially for things like reliability of Thread products in my home, in my experience. And, I think it's clear that, Apple obviously has the capabilities to invest time and talented thought into any of these problems and solving that with software or hardware. I just think that, with Wi-Fi specifically, it's so key to so much of the experience of their devices in homes that I think both from a security and performance perspective, I think they could do more than just what they ship in terms of software on their own devices, but in terms of how that could also be related to the network. And I love your concept of, how HomeKit router was sort of a first step towards a zero trust networking architecture. And, one of my other concerns that I brought up with HomeKit router when I first looked at it as, was just that I was concerned about the manufacturers of all these smart home devices wouldn't necessarily test on that scenario. So I think the biggest concern that Apple probably would have to have something that they're doing take off would be to do something that is forgiving enough and or mainstream enough that users can actually see a reliability increase from it. Because I think from what I heard, a lot of people who did turn on HomeKit router had issues where random devices wouldn't work because they weren't tested in those kind of scenarios and were just expecting that they'd be able to see all these other devices on your network. Maybe in the desire to make a seamless setup experience, but obviously it wasn't as secure. And so I think that's really a key piece of this, is that whatever Apple does, they need to make it so that users are actually getting a better experience and it's actually a step forward. And I think they're more than capable of it. That's, to me, the most important thing I want to see from whatever potential move they make here.
Well said. I think we all need to remember that changing anything in networking is a slow process. We really have to give it time and to build acceptance on both the equipment side, the consumer side, the manufacturer side. I mean, much as we're seeing with Matter, you just have to have brute force perseverance to let it get to the point where it succeeds or fails on its merits. Right now, we're still ironing out the kinks, and most of us want to give it the benefit of the doubt. The same thing needs to be done with things like a secure router or other efforts. Even Apple can't expect to put it out there and have instant 100% uptake and all the benefits outweigh the pain or confusion in going there. Maybe Apple will revisit that and give it another go. They're also really good at having both carrot and stick. So it may take a little more stick behind the scenes to encourage the manufacturers. It may take a little more carrot of clear-cut privacy or other benefits from using it. So consumers will want to turn it on.
Yeah, completely agree. Key components to a successful move here.
Well, Eric, I want to thank you for joining me today. It's been a wonderful discussion. I don't think we disagreed on everything, and we just kind of a little bit of different nuance and different take here and there. But we're both really interested in seeing Apple succeed and do more with smart home and provide easier to use and less technical support issues. I don't like trying to troubleshoot HomeKit networks. There's more exciting things to do with more value for customers or us as users. So how should people get a hold of you, online or offline?
Sure. So you can check channel over on YouTube. I'm at Eric Welander there on YouTube. And then you can also visit my website, ericw.org, and that'll have links to things like my newsletter, as well as, of course, my YouTube channel.
Great. Thank you. Are you happy with the Wi-Fi stuff you use now? Or would you be excited to use anything Apple would make? I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments below. Beyond working Wi-Fi and Ethernet, one of the best networking techniques to master is how to set up easier remote access back to your home network. Free Tailscale software makes setting up such a virtual private network much easier. Find out how by watching this video next.